Indeed, my love, he paid Teresa very great attention on the last assembly night, said Mrs. Malderton, addressing her spouse, who, after the fatigues of the day in the city, was sitting with a silk handkerchief over his head and his feet on the fender, drinking his port. Very great attention, and I say again, every possible encouragement ought to be given him. He positively must be asked down here to dine. Who must? Inquired Mr. Malderton. Why, you know whom I mean, my dear. The young man with the black whiskers and the white cravat, who has just come out at our assembly, and whom all the girls are talking about. Young... oh, dear me, what's his name? Marianne, what is his name? Continued Mrs. Malderton, addressing her youngest daughter, who was engaged in netting a purse, and looking sentimental. Mr. Horatio Sparkins, ma, replied Miss Marianne with a sigh. Oh, yes, to be sure, Horatio Sparkins, said Mrs. Malderton. Decidedly the most gentlemanlike young man I ever saw. I'm sure in the beautifully made coat he wore the other night he looked like Prince Leopold, ma. So noble, so full of sentiment, suggested Marianne in a tone of enthusiastic admiration. You should recollect, my dear, resumed Mrs. Malderton, that Teresa is now 28, and that it really is very important that something should be done. Miss Teresa Malderton was a very little girl, rather fat, with vermilion cheeks, but good-humoured and still disengaged, although, to do her justice, the misfortune arose from no lack of perseverance on her part. In vain had she flirted for 10 years. In vain had Mr. and Mrs. Malderton assiduously kept up an extensive acquaintance among the young eligible bachelors of Camberwell, and even of Wandsworth and Brixton, to say nothing of those who dropped in from town. Miss Malderton was as well known as the lion on the top of Northumberland House, and had an equal chance of going off. I am quite sure you'd like him, continued Mrs. Malderton. He is so gentlemanly. So clever, said Miss Marianne. And has such a flow of language, added Miss Teresa. He has a great respect for you, my dear, said Mrs. Malderton to her husband. Mr. Malderton coughed and looked at the fire. Yes, I'm sure he's very much attached to pa's society, said Miss Marianne. No doubt of it, echoed Miss Teresa. Indeed, he said as much to me in confidence, observed Mrs. Malderton. Well, well, returned Mr. Malderton, somewhat flattered. If I see him at the assembly tomorrow, perhaps I'll ask him down. I hope he knows we live at Oak Lodge, Camberwell, my dear. Of course, and that you keep a one-horse carriage. I'll see about it, said Mr. Malderton, composing himself for a nap. I'll see about it.